The extraordinary thing about it was that I then saw the whole scene from the ceiling.
You also saw yourself?
Yes, the whole scene, everything. I've developed my own theory that this trauma, as brutal as it is, somehow opens a door to another world. What I could take with me were images that were so otherworldly, of cities that shone golden, that were incredibly beautiful. I had a feeling there. This can only be heaven.
Frau Trojan, Sie sind Künstlerin und...
Ms. Trojan, you are an artist and describe your life as a true collection of strange events and supernatural occurrences. I would very much like to talk to you about this today. And I want to begin with an event from your childhood. At around the age of 4, you had a near-death experience under very traumatic circumstances. I'd like to ask you to tell us how this experience came about. What can you still remember today?
Ja, sehr schön. Danke, dass Sie hier sind heute. Freue ich mich sehr.
Yes, of course. Thank you for having me here today. I'm very happy. I have to go back a little to this near-death experience with which my conscious life began. My mother is from Austria, from a more or less wealthy family that was deeply traumatized by the war. Both parents were very traumatized by the war, and it was a very violent household. My grandmother was an artist, my mother was a young artist, and she wasn't allowed to follow her dreams with my father. She wanted to become a singer, an imitation artist. She imitated Louis Armstrong, Theo Lingen. That was her thing. And then, when she was very young, from one day to the next, she ran away from home, got on a plane and went to Cologne. That's how she became a migrant in Germany in the 1970s. And she had me relatively quickly. She was 22 when I was born and was completely overwhelmed by raising me, having a child, and being a single mother. My father was out of the picture, and so she placed me quite early again and again in the care of strangers. People who said, yes, we'll look after the child. And she didn't always pick me up again in very good condition. It could be that I already had some near-death experiences then, which I don't remember. In any case, I was often close to starving. That's how she described it.
How can one imagine that? She left you there for months, years?
No, always just from time to time. I was given a job. Could you look after my child while I'm away for 1 or 2 weeks? That's how it was. Then I was with her for a while. We built a bond. And then, at about 3.5 or 4 years old, she gave me to a new family. She also paid them. She always paid the people who posed as foster parents, private individuals who took care of children. And this was a married couple. I still remember arriving there, and it wasn't very nice there. How should I put it? It's a bit hard to explain. I don't want to go into every detail now. I'd rather spare the viewers. They were very violent. They beat me a lot. There was another foster child there, and they also had 2 biological children. They mistreated us severely, even to the point of drowning games in the bathroom.
That was, so to speak, abuse that didn't come from an inability to deal with a child, but from real sadism.
Yes, real sadism. Nothing sexual, not those kinds of things. Not that I can remember. But when it got really bad, they repeatedly drowned me in the bathtub and then pulled me out again. And then came the big day when it was so bad that I left my body. The extraordinary thing about it was that I then saw this whole scene from the ceiling.
You saw yourself as well?
Yes, the whole scene. That must have been near the end, relatively at the end. And this image has followed me all my life. I wouldn't say that I suffered terribly from it, but the image of witnessing this event from above, looking down from the bathroom ceiling, they drowned me in the toilet. That's such a bizarre or grotesque thing that when you see it, that image probably will stay awful for me for the rest of my life. What's especially striking is that the next image I remember is biting my foster mother's finger. That's the image I still have, and with that, my ordeal ended.
And this image of biting, was that also from the perspective above?
No, that was back inside my body again. It was a sudden idea that came to me because by then I had also started stuttering badly. They of course prepared me when my mother came for visits, so I wouldn't tell her anything. With threats, of course, the way you can threaten children. They just keep their mouths shut. And the hints I gave my mother back then weren't relevant enough for her. She was also just too young, too naive, and simply overwhelmed. This foster mother always locked me up in a cupboard. I remember how she reached in with her hand, and I bit down on it. And then, hours later, she stuck a plaster-covered finger in, and that was it. They then said that they were terminating the foster arrangement. I went back to my mother and was then relatively early left on my own, because my mother eventually started working very hard and then had no more time. What's really special about the situation for me is there was no before. I can't say before it was different. After I came home again, I must have been about 5 years old, I could suddenly read. That's one example. I never had to learn it. It was just there. I would say if I hadn't had my books throughout my childhood and youth, which supported me, nurtured me, and comforted me, I don't know what would have become of my life.
I'd like to go back a bit to the experience itself. This image of seeing yourself from above, you still remember it vividly today.
Yes.
Could you perhaps say something more about the feelings you had then? Were there any special sensations? Did you feel safe at the moment?
There were two kinds of feelings. There's the view I have now as an observer. When I look back on the situation, I see a child being severely abused. And that breaks my heart for that child. But not for me. Do you know what I mean? There's a child being brutally abused, and that makes me incredibly sad. If I were to see it in a film, I'd feel the same way. Back then, when I saw it from the ceiling, I would say I had no feelings at all. It was simply a complete detachment from the situation. On the one hand, the feeling of being completely gone, cut off, like you are there and I am here. And then there is the second view I have when I look back today. I am now a mother of 4 children, and I find it outrageous to do something like that to children, because there's absolutely no excuse or justification for it. What's special for me, which I never questioned and only realized years later isn't normal, is that I have a cinematic memory. That means I film everything, every situation. If it's very boring, I leave the camera off. But generally, if something even slightly affects me, I'm filming. For me, that was completely normal. When I go home, I can play the situation back and forth from every perspective, above, below, from the side. This has, of course, helped me my whole life, because I could analyze situations better, observe my own actions better. It helps me develop better. It's always been a great help, a strong help, this ability.
Do you think that's also connected to this out-of-body experience?
I honestly can't say.
This meta-level view.
I can't say for sure, because there's no before. My consciousness also only began at that time.
There are many reports of near-death experiences in children that suggest special abilities are observed afterwards.
Yes.
That fits quite well.
I always thought it was normal, but then, over the years, I started asking, is it not? I remember things, I would say. I've probably stored about 80% of my life from that day on, from that time since 1975. Before that, there's basically darkness. Another thing is, I'm precognitive, and have been for as long as I can think. As a child, I couldn't categorize it very well. As a child, when I had these premonitions or precognitions, it wasn't very intellectual. I was cautious, and I would say, I can feel what people feel. And when people came toward me in an unpleasant way, I grew up in a very, very rough area, Cologne, Mülheim Nord. That's considered Cologne's most dangerous hotspot district. And it was already like that in the 70s. We were in the migrant quarter, and it was a very tough environment. I was left on my own very early. And of course, that was a helpful ability that I could really use. As a child, I didn't yet know the connections, but I knew that I had to be very careful in certain situations. I just knew, go away, don't do that, things like that. I was a very lonely child. My mother was mostly working very hard. She was very industrious. She supported us on her own. I was constantly alone and read a lot.
But through your intuition and precognition, you also somehow felt well guided. Would you say that?
Yes, you could say that. I also had an imaginary friend very early on. The first imagination was a twin sister who accompanied me. Very early on, I think at 8 or 9, it started that I saw things that I live today. I knew I wouldn't stay there long. I knew I'd be back in Vienna at 18. I even told my friends back then. They couldn't believe it. But everything I had seen came true. Also what I had seen for friends back then, school friends. Today as adults, I'm still in touch with some of those girls. And it all happened as I had seen it. Only later, over the years, the more intellectual I became, I didn't interpret it as something supernatural. I started to see it more like, well, if you think deeply enough, you come to such insights. That's how I carried it throughout my youth, and later, up until I was 30, 35, even 40 years old.
So you didn't look for further explanations?
Not really. My mother was a very spiritual woman. She was deeply interested in Christian ideas, Buddhism and Hare Krishna. We also got to know the Hare Krishna. But my mother was always more of an observer. She never actually joined any sect. She just wanted to have a look. So I came into contact with such people very early on. But over the years, I distanced myself from that and became more focused on the scientific side.
I'd like to go back to something else, because it's always a fascinating aspect of near-death experiences, the after effects. People often report unusual abilities. You briefly mentioned your ability to read. That became very important for you, didn't it? You taught yourself?
Yes, I could suddenly read. I still remember I was back home with my mother. I was visiting a friend who had just started school. She was a year older. It was autumn. I was 5, a year younger than she was. Her father asked me, "Can you read yet?" I was terribly ashamed to say no. I was so embarrassed to admit it. Then he said, "Look at the television." The letters on the screen said ZDF, and I read aloud ZDF. From that day on, I could read. I picked up a book at home and could read it. It was suddenly there. I was always the best reader in school, but because I was such a severe stutterer, I had extreme difficulties at school.
And this stuttering was naturally also connected to those early experiences?
Yes, definitely.
How did you overcome that? You don't stutter at all anymore today.
My life was extremely difficult, financially and otherwise. Growing up in Cologne-Mülheim, especially in the northern part, everything was very hard. Schooling, life itself. My father was Turkish. You could see that I was of Mediterranean appearance, and I also had to deal with racism. My mother named me Tanja. She foresaw a bit of that so that my name wouldn't immediately reveal my background. But even so, I received very little support from my teachers. Because I stuttered, I spoke very little, fell through the cracks of the schooling system, and got little help. It was very, very hard for me, getting through school, getting through daily life as a stutterer. I was more or less on my own. I experienced the cruelty of people firsthand, even from adults, how they treat those who have weaknesses. That, I think, was something I was meant to experience in this lifetime. To know what it's like to be an outsider, a migrant. My mother was Austrian. In that sense, we were somewhat spared, because Austrians had a relatively good standing in Germany. People would say, "They're Austrians." There was no Austrian community, though. Austrians don't emigrate much. We were the only ones. But my southern looks often gave teachers an excuse to torment or humiliate me. So I've always had big issues with teachers. That's why I became self-taught, an autodidact.
And did the stuttering go away by itself?
No, the despair just grew. I searched for ways to free myself from it, and over the years developed a technique to overcome the stutter. Since speech therapy was financially out of the question. Over time, my technique became more refined. I understood the cause and effect fairly quickly. I wouldn't say one is ever truly healed. Once a stutterer, always a stutterer, they say. But with me, you can't hear it anymore. I have no problem speaking. I can say whatever I want without inner pressure. That pressure lasted until I was about 24 or 25. By around 27, the problem had completely disappeared. I'm writing a book about it, to help others free themselves from the chains of stuttering. I see stuttering as a chain, a shackle.
What was most important for you in that process?
A large vocabulary, getting to know words, understanding the energy of words, realizing that words can be both enemies and friends, and understanding that when you expand your vocabulary, you'll inevitably move away from your environment, because every social environment has its own vocabulary. People speak within their linguistic limits. For example, if someone from a small village who always says, "Good day," suddenly says "Buenos dias" because it feels easier to pronounce, they'll no longer be fully accepted in that group. That's a simple example. The more you actively expand your vocabulary, not just passively, the more your environment will inevitably change. There's hardly anything that transforms your surroundings faster than actively expanding and using your vocabulary. And then you can simply say, "This word isn't my friend. Its frequency doesn't resonate with me." When you stop viewing words superficially, today I see my former stutter as my greatest teacher, not my enemy. It forced me to truly learn the essence of language, from the ground up. For me, language is humanity. It's our means of expression. You don't want to be friends with every word. There are words I simply don't use. I'll leave them out. That's how I healed myself. There are a few other important aspects for people who stutter, but it all comes down to self-development.
Speaking of language, you also carried that childhood experience inside you for a long time. Were you ever able to talk to anyone about it, even hint at it?
Yes, of course, with my mother. She had her share of guilt. She told me later that she had already suspected those people weren't right. Today I have my own theory about it, which might not be entirely understandable to everyone. My mother was traumatized. My grandmother was traumatized. I come from a traumatized family. How far back it goes is hard to say, but I think even my great-grandparents were severely traumatized. It seems to me that parents sometimes pass their trauma on. Sometimes it comes directly from them, sometimes from strangers. My mother didn't take things into her own hands the way her father did. She let others do it. I don't do that with my children. They should have their own experiences elsewhere. I've developed my own theory that trauma, as brutal as it is, somehow opens a gateway to the other world. Because my mother was never fully here. She was always somehow between worlds. She's an incredibly good person. Throughout her life, and it became stronger over time, it was extremely important for her to do good. Good not necessarily within her own group, because we never belonged to any group. We were always observers. She observed the Jehovah's Witnesses, the Krishnas, the Buddhists, and formed her own opinion. For my mother, it was deeply important to help people she didn't even know. People in need she encountered. She was a very warm-hearted person. She was, how shall I say, very emotional through her vulnerability, and deeply focused on giving love and doing good. I followed that same path.
And there was that close bond of trust between you, that you could talk about all this.
Yes, of course there was. We had a very good relationship. Of course, the painful point is that despite her bad feeling, she still handed me over back then. That shaped my life. But apart from that, even though she had little time, she gave me endless love. Endless love for which I'm deeply grateful. And perhaps I wouldn't have taken the path I did, become an artist, raised 4 children. Perhaps none of that would have happened if that gateway to the other side hadn't opened a little through that injury, that trauma.
Do you also feel that through having to endure that experience, you received a kind of strength that helped you later in difficult situations?
Yes, absolutely. It's always hard to say, what do I have? What do others have? But when I talk to close friends about my life, about the difficulties I faced, they often can't believe that a person could go through all that and not end up mentally ill, addicted to drugs or in prostitution. Because honestly, those were the typical life paths for people in the neighborhood where I grew up. There were a few exceptions, the ones supported by teachers. They did well academically. I wasn't one of them. I fell through the cracks, so to speak. And I'd definitely say there were forces that supported me and protected me from much harm. We were outsiders in that area, outsiders among outsiders because we didn't participate. We didn't join in gossip, cruelty, or illegal things. That was everyday life there, selling drugs, prostitution. Many girls began prostituting themselves at 14 or 15 if they failed in school. So there were clear distinctions. And there was always a voice, a force, that showed me other images. I had different visions. I even brought about a family reunion when I was about 11 or 12, so that my mother reconnected with her parents. That was basically my initiative. And that's how it happened that at 18, my mother and I returned to Austria.
And your father never played a role?
No, he wouldn't have had a place with us. We even discussed it as such. We've always had such a close mother-daughter bond. There was simply no room for him. I did have contact with him later, after I turned 18. I share many traits with him, even the entrepreneurial side. He's no longer alive. But all my love belongs to my mother.
You wrote to me beforehand that dreams have always played an important role for you, and still do. In what way?
That's always been the case. I can still remember dreams from childhood. Altogether, I'd say I've had about 5 very extraordinary dreams, though I wouldn't call them dreams exactly, but astral journeys. I believe that at night, all people travel astrally through different dimensions. I'm not always in the highest ones. Sometimes I'm on other levels. But those 5 dreams were extraordinary because they were on a very high level. When I returned, when I woke up, I felt, now I know everything. Now I understand the world. I finally get it. I couldn't bring much knowledge back. But what I did bring were images so otherworldly, of cities glowing gold, so beautiful. I had a feeling there, this can only be heaven. Those were about 5 dreams throughout my life. One as a child, then as a teenager, then as a woman, and later around 40. Then I have my normal astral dreams, where I'm traveling astrally but in lower realms. When I wake up, I know I've been astral traveling. Those aren't the highest spheres, but they're pleasant journeys.
And those experiences always felt very real.
Yes. I've always remembered my dreams easily. Not every detail, but enough. Ordinary dreams don't interest me, but I simply feel, upon waking, what I've just been through. If I've been very active astrally, I sometimes wake up completely exhausted, physically worn out. It probably has to do with how I re-enter my body, how I wake up, or how I'm awakened. I sleep a lot. I have a great need for sleep. It was the same with my mother. We called ourselves sleepers. My grandmother too. We were all sleepers. All the women in our family always slept a lot. I also find solutions to problems in my dreams. If I'm searching for a new concept, something special, I focus on it, go to sleep, and in the best case, wake up with a solution. Everything comes at night for me. For me, dreams have the same value as waking consciousness.
You've mentioned your mother several times. She has since passed on. And after her death, you experienced after-death contacts. Could you tell us a little about that time?
Yes. It actually began well before my mother passed away. In 2015, I was diagnosed with cancer, and that profoundly changed my perception. Around 2018, I began to think of people I knew, acquaintances or old friends. And then a week later, I'd learned that they had died. At first, I thought, well, coincidence. I'd explain it rationally, since I lean more towards science than spirituality. Later, I cared for a friend who had cancer. I knew already in January that she would pass in the autumn. And that's exactly what happened. I said to myself, well, she was sick. It's not unusual for people in her condition to die in the fall, and I dismissed it. In my mother's case, it was 2021. I was cleaning the bathroom, and suddenly I started thinking about a friend I hadn't seen or heard from in 20 years. We hadn't seen each other since our youth. As I cleaned, our entire story came back to me, our highs, our lows, everything. Then it was gone. A week later, my son called me and said, "Do you know who died last week?" It was that friend. And I thought, okay, he never crosses my mind. I hadn't really thought of him in 20 years, and suddenly he appeared in my mind. And then my mother's passing happened. Months before, we were talking on the phone. We called each other daily. She lived in Vienna. I live in the countryside. We had already said our goodbyes in a way, talking about what it would be like when she was gone. We comforted each other. She wanted to make an agreement with me that when she was on the other side, she would send me a sign. I didn't want to go along with it because I didn't want to think about her dying. A day before she died, or rather, her official date of death is June the 1st. The doctor determined that because we only found her on June 1st. My last phone call with my mother was at 5:40 p.m. She said a very harsh goodbye to me. She probably couldn't have left any other way. She said, "I feel sick," and hung up. She had never spoken to me like that before. She wouldn't have been able to go otherwise. Half an hour later, I took out all the pictures from her youth photos from an old chest and nailed them to the wall. That must have been when she passed. The next morning, I called. She didn't pick up. Then I knew I would drive to her and that she would no longer be alive. The first after-death contact happened then. While we found her at home, I was there with my son, and he heard footsteps in her apartment. Water spilled toward the fuse box, and the electricity shut off immediately. I had the feeling someone was standing there and clicked it off. That was the first time. Then came 2023. The after-death contact with my mother was extremely strong. It was on May 31st, her death day. I was driving in the car. I always keep my phone on the passenger seat if the kids aren't with me, and listen to Spotify, never the radio. When my husband called me around the same time I had last spoken to my mother 2 years earlier, he said to me, "Why did you send me an emergency photo?" I parked at the cemetery. I was on my way to my mother's grave. He had received from my phone a photo taken from below, pointed up at me. My phone camera had turned on by itself and photographed me from below. You can tell it's me, but it actually looked like my mother. Of course we resemble each other, but from that angle, at first glance, you think it was my mom. And it happened at the same time of day as that last call with her. And then there was a news report on the radio mentioning Floridsdorf, where one of her favorite grandsons lives. In the background, if you listen closely, you can hear her voice very softly, "Hello." For me, that was an after-death contact, which gave me immense strength, and was also a sign that she made an effort to show herself to me, to show that things continue on the other side.
Was that the main message of these contacts? That life goes on?
That was somehow already clear, but there was a residual doubt. She very much wanted to agree on a sign with me, and I wouldn't agree to it. She insisted. A week before that happened, I also had a dream, which for me wasn't a normal dream. Late morning, I lay down for a bit, and I met her in the stairwell, without a chest, without feet, without hands, and she hugged me. It was such an incredibly beautiful experience. I could feel her. I was happy. I cried. She was enormous, very, very tall. She didn't really look the way she had in life, but her features were recognizable. She was a completely different being, though.
But there was something unmistakably her in that being.
I clearly recognized that it was my mother, but I wouldn't say she looked as she had in life. She appeared dark. She had no chest, no feet, no hands, and yet she hugged me. It was supernatural and deeply soothing. I woke up with tears streaming down my face, ran into the stairwell, and everything smelled like my mother. And then, a week later, on the 31st, the thing with the photo happened. For me, that was simply incredible, and it makes me very happy and very sure things go on. But those weren't my only after-death contacts.
With whom else?
In 2023, 2 people died whom I didn't know very well. I knew them, but not closely. And I saw the death of one of them 3 days beforehand. I was at a doctor's office and fell into a sort of light trance. That happens whenever I'm making art. I enter that state. I looked at her and said, "When he's no longer here, it will be very dark there." She said, "What are you saying? What are you saying?" I said, "I don't know." I felt embarrassed. But 3 days later, he passed away. What was interesting was that up to that point, I had never posted anything on my WhatsApp status. I suddenly felt a strong urge to write. Lots of sentences came to mind. I posted them to my status, and the first person to view them was him. At 3:13 p.m., I posted another line. Yes, that's how it is. A confirmation of what I'd been writing. They were spiritual statements about how we function in this world. And he was again the first to view them. An hour later, the phone rang, and a woman said to me, "I don't know why I'm calling you, but you just came to mind, and I've just learned that so-and-so has died." It was a huge shock, because everything suddenly fit together.
So it was him who had answered.
Yes.
The one who died. Was it an accident?
No, he died of lung failure. Shortly after he last viewed my status, he passed away. I think 5 or 6 hours later it began. He was here with me. We weren't close, but we had a good rapport. I liked him. I liked him very much. I think he liked me too. And he was here with tremendous bull-like force. He was that kind of person in life as well. He knew how to assert himself. He wanted me to pass on a message to one of his survivors. I was completely unprepared. I was overwhelmed, especially by the intensity of his presence. I wouldn't say he stood before me dictating what I should do. I describe it as words suddenly forming in my head. I passed them on to the person I was supposed to tell.
Did you know this person?
I did, but not well.
So you didn't know this person very well?
We knew of each other. It was very uncomfortable for me, but he wanted it. He remained with me until Monday, 2 more days, and sent me additional things. I passed those on to the bereaved as well. We never talked about it. I didn't want to. I just thought to myself, I couldn't possibly have made that up. I don't know him that well.
There were pieces of information to resolve things.
Yes, to clarify some matters. I had known nothing about them. And he also transmitted something else that unfolded exactly as he said it would, a year later. That was very interesting. A few months later came the second contact. I hardly knew her.
Those were true mediumistic contacts.
Extremely strong contacts. That's when I started looking into whether I was still sane, to be honest. It overwhelmed me. It gripped me. It's a very particular feeling. You feel almost entirely over there already. It's hard to come back. The second contact was a few months later. Again, a person I didn't really know, but I knew the house. I often drove past it when picking up my children from the train station. But on that day, 3 days before the person died, thousands of images poured out of the house and into me. Thousands of images, everything, childhood, youth, everything.
From that person's life?
Yes. I was utterly stunned. and insides all sorts of things. A flood. I could only catch a few images. And at the end, a funeral that should not be here, that would not take place here. I still didn't think someone is going to die. But it was a very strange feeling. 3 days later, I learned that the person had died. Then I knew, okay, brace yourself, something is coming.
And did it?
It did, but in a completely different way. Not with that demanding, forceful energy. Very reserved, very dignified. I had absolute choice over whether to pass along what she was going to dictate. It was up to me. And I did it. It felt like a very honorable task, because the presence of the deceased was indescribably elevated. It must have been a highly developed soul. The feeling was otherworldly. It was magnificent. And I passed on the message she gave me. In the following months, I then completed training in Switzerland to become an afterlife medium.
So you wanted to cultivate it deliberately?
No, not to cultivate it. I wanted to understand it. I wanted to understand how this could be possible. Through that course, I learned a lot about how it works. And then I closed the channels for myself. I don't want that anymore. Because due to my health history, the cancer, it takes a lot of energy. It does provide endless confirmation that there is an afterlife. I love doubt. There must be doubt. There's still a bit of doubt left. But for me, with my mother and the 2 contacts after, it's crystal clear that it continues on. It's a very beautiful feeling, and I'm very grateful I experienced it. But I don't want to serve as a medium. I can't.
Let's briefly return to your cancer diagnosis. You mentioned it. It came in 2015, and you hinted that it was another turning point in your life.
Yes. Up to then, I had certainly always followed an unusual path, different from the ordinary, let's say, because I simply have ideas. Maybe that's a gift. I get ideas. In the worst situations, something occurs to me, and I learn very quickly. I read very quickly. Those have been my aids in life. During my cancer diagnosis, the doctors wanted to put me through the full hospital procedure.
So the cancer appeared suddenly, and you had to start treatment immediately.
Yes. I'd already had to deal with quite a few blows of fate involving my children, but that was the peak. Within a very short time, I learned more about my own cancer than many doctors knew, and became very well informed about the entire process, medicine, pharmaceuticals, everything. I researched thoroughly. The cancer had already gone through the sentinel nodes. It had spread. After the surgery and the treatments, I only allowed the absolute minimum. I refused about half of what was recommended. I experienced another major leap in consciousness. I became even more empathetic. What struck me most strongly was this overwhelming desire to keep living. And that was because I hadn't loved enough yet. After the surgery, it became very clear to me I didn't have an out-of-body experience, at least not consciously. But when I woke up, I had an entirely new, fresh zest for life. I came out of the surgery incredibly strengthened. I had forces I couldn't explain. I had 3 small children, really very little ones. I walked around with a blood bag tied to my side. My mother was completely overwhelmed with the children. I had this strength I couldn't account for. Step by step, I completely reoriented my life. I understood clearly that being here in this life is important in order to love. I had learned that from my mother, though she never put it into words. She simply did it. That was just how she lived, without thinking about it. But after the surgery, it became absolutely clear. That is the only reason, and I felt I hadn't loved enough. Now I need to love people and to serve, to truly give the best I could, beyond my children, which of course I take as a given, but outside of them as well, doing something without being paid for it. Even though I see value in service and in money, money is a wonderful thing. It was important to simply do something for others without expecting anything back. If someone stands before me who needs help, who is alone and no one else cares, and I have the time and resources, then I will do it. And I think in recent years I've managed to stand up for certain causes, to follow that calling.
After your experience, your love of art also developed. Photography and sculptures.
I had already been a photographer before, because of my photographic, almost cinematic memory. When I look at people, I see things. I see a lot when people don't speak. Then I see most clearly who they are. That's how my photography evolved. My artistic drive became to capture the essence of the person or of the subject. That's not what commercial photography demands. Commercial photography follows strict formulas, how a picture should look, the posed smile, all that. But art, true art, is about seeing the human being or the object as it really is. And in the best case, the viewer and the object merge. Then a work of art can be born. I had a strong wish for that. I simply couldn't sign my name to commercial images anymore. My time was too precious. I believe we only really begin to live once we've died. I have to admit, I've always wanted to die. My first suicide attempt was when I was 6 or 7. I put my head under the blanket and thought, okay, if I stay here long enough, I'll die. Then it got hot. So yes, I've always had a longing for death. My mother did too, even stronger. When people say, life is so beautiful, hooray, I can't agree with that, because to say that, you have to ignore so much.
Consciously overlook things.
Maybe my little life at the moment is beautiful, yes, but to say life is beautiful, I can't. When I look around, I see so much pain, sorrow, and injustice. And somewhere inside, I know there's a place where it's different. I don't know exactly where that knowledge comes from. But through the cancer and the closeness of death, which in my case was quite real, because the cancer had spread, I came to terms with it. My husband and I discussed everything clearly. Can you manage with the children if I go? I'm taking an alternative path with this cancer. Do you agree? That was important to me, that he would go along with it. Once I had accepted it, I felt, now I'm truly alive. That was a different quality of consciousness, a different kind of life after the illness. That's why I say, we only really start living once we've died.
So for you it was this combination, the seriousness of being close to death and the decision to take your life into your own hands.
Exactly. But after the surgery, I came back with a clear knowledge of how important it is to love, in a very concrete way. To love, to learn, to be conscious. Of course, loving my children is part of that, but not only them, also reaching outward as much as I can. That gave me a completely new quality of life. The desire for death, which I had carried with me all my life as a child, was finally softened. I have no fear of dying. I actually look forward to it. But I still have things to do. I haven't loved enough yet. I still have children, I still have tasks. And I think I still have a lot to learn. I'm not finished learning.
Your photography reached a new level.
Yes, it did.
And how did sculpting came into your life?
Suddenly, overnight. My daughter changed schools. Through various detours, she ended up at a convent school. That completed a kind of circle, because my mother also went to a convent school, and I myself was under the care of Don Bosco in Cologne-Mülheim. That was our big salvation back then. At that school, during enrollment, there was a huge statue of Jesus. I looked at it, and it was enormous. The headmaster showed me the building, its long artistic tradition. And afterward, I realized I had felt something pass through me. A week later, I made my first sculpture. Without ever having learned it, I just did what I had imagined as a child. As a child, I had visions that I would sculpt heads someday. And that's exactly what happened. Of course, I read a few books to learn technique and studied the masters. YouTube helps a lot nowadays. Since then, I've created these works just for myself, for our family.
You also did regression sessions at some point to better understand your childhood experiences we talked about earlier. Was that successful?
I've done several regressions in my life. I started in 2007. That was my first. It's an incredibly interesting perspective to expanding yourself. Looking into other lives through regression therapy. At best, you bring those images back into this life and it broadens you. I've had very good experiences with excellent regression specialists. About once every 5 years, not excessively. 2025, early in the year, I felt the wish to revisit my near-death experience as a 4 or 5-year-old. But from the regression perspective, because I wanted to explore the missing part of it. I had only ever seen myself out of body. There was a break between me here and them there, and I wanted to know if there was something I'd forgotten. The regression fascinated me so much that I later trained in the method myself. Not to practice it professionally, but to understand it, to know how it works. The therapist guided me not into a past life, but into this life. She specialized in that. I chose her deliberately. She led me back to that time. I saw things I couldn't remember before, how I arrived there, how I was brought in. I saw a woman completely overwhelmed. The despair in her eyes, which I hadn't remembered. The man who committed the abuse was her husband, an older man who during the Nazi era had held some authority. He was about 65 when it happened in 1975. I think there was also a racial element because he knew my father was Turkish. I believe it stemmed from that. I later analyzed it with my mother. In the regression, I saw the kind of person he was. Not just the acts of violence, but his mindset. And I saw that there was no intent to kill. The therapist then led me back into the bathroom scene. My mother was present. Her spirit, though not visible, but clearly there. I consciously brought her with me. And there in that bathroom, where I had floated at the ceiling, I saw something new. A black rift opened on the floor. And in that rift was a violet light. I saw the whole scene again, but from a different perspective. I hovered around the couple who were holding me by the feet, dipping me like a fish into the toilet bowl, up and down. Then the image froze. They stood there like statues. Everything was still. And I was calm. It was utterly peaceful. There was absolute peace in that bathroom during the regression, indescribable peace. Then there was that violet light within the black rift. My therapist guided me beautifully, asking what I wanted to do. I touched them, those two frozen figures, and they turned to dust. And in that moment, I had the absolute certainty that I had had a choice back then, to go or to stay, and I chose to stay. That was clear. And that everything as it was right. I was brought back, filled with peace. It was an indescribably powerful experience, one that purified a lot within me. Also an understanding, why do people do such things to a child? I've never felt hatred. Never. I never hated them. Only a kind of residual feeling of guilt or defilement that often remains in people who experience such things. I mean, to dunk a child, a human being at the start of life, into a toilet bowl, it connects with filth, with flushing, with shame. That stays in a person. But through the regression, all of that was neutralized. It became clear that woman was utterly overwhelmed with her 2 biological children and 2 foster children. She was a helpless woman, and the man, His nature was so low, so base, that he probably didn't even comprehend what he was doing. He was simply following his instincts. And through that, I was able to let it go. It's resolved for me. I often study things not to practice them, but simply to understand them.
So, in that regression, you saw the entire situation again, including the feelings of the other people. And the dissolution of the figures symbolized resolving the trauma.
Yes, that's a good way to put it. It was really a good thing. It freed me. What was interesting was that I didn't know what to make of the black rift and the violet light. I asked my therapist, why wasn't there white light? Why black? And then, a few weeks later, I saw one of your programs where you mentioned that children with early near-death experiences often see black with violet light. That confirmed for me that this wasn't just imagination, as is always possible, but that something real had happened. I'd say that was the missing piece of my near-death experience as a child.
Looking back, taking all your experiences together, have you formed a kind of worldview? What, in your eyes, is life about? Is there a plan?
Yes. Yes. Love, learning, consciousness. That's all.
Thank you very much for the conversation.
You're welcome.